The spring sun hung low over Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the dusty town square. It was late April, but the air still carried a bitter chill that cut through worn coats and threadbare shawls. The townsfolk had gathered in unusual numbers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cruelty, drawn by the promise of spectacle on this otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. Rachel Matthews stood on the makeshift platform, her arms wrapped protectively around the bundle at her chest. The baby, barely 3 months old, whimpered softly against her, sensing perhaps the tension that crackled through the crowd like lightning before a storm. Rachel's dress, once a respectable blue calico, now hung loose on her gaunt frame, the fabric faded and patched in places. Her auburn hair, hastily pinned, had come loose in strands that framed her hollow cheeks. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. Samuel Pritchard was a man who'd sold everything from cattle to farm equipment, but even he seemed uncomfortable with today's particular commodity. "We're here to settle the debts of the late William Matthews, as demanded by his family." Rachel's former brother-in-law, Thomas Matthews, stood near the platform, his face set in grim satisfaction. Beside him, William's cousin James nodded approvingly, tobacco juice staining the corner of his mouth. They'd made it clear enough. Rachel was a burden they could no longer bear, eating their food, taking up space in what had been their brother's house. The fact that she'd worked herself to the bone trying to keep the farm running after William's death meant nothing to them. "The widow Matthews," the auctioneer continued, his voice faltering slightly, "comes with the child. Bidding starts at $20. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Some shook their heads in disgust, not at the proceedings, but at the low starting price. Others leaned forward with interest, their eyes appraising Rachel like horsemen examining stock. $25, the voice came from the back, and Rachel's blood ran cold. Randall Carlson pushed his way forward, his fine suit and polished boots marking him as a man of means. He owned the largest ranch in the county, along with shares in the mine and 2 saloons in town. What he wanted, he usually got, and the look in his eyes as they raked over Rachel made her stomach turn. "30, called another voice, Jake Morrison, who ran the boarding house on the edge of town. His establishment had a reputation that made decent women cross to the other side of the street. Rachel clutched her daughter tighter, feeling the platform sway beneath her feet. Or perhaps it was her own legs, weak from days of little food and sleepless nights. The baby began to cry in earnest now, a thin, reedy wail that seemed to echo her mother's despair. "Shut that brat up," someone shouted from the crowd. "Can't hear the bidding." 35 from Mr. Carlson, the auctioneer announced. Rachel tried to soothe the baby, bouncing her gently, but fear had dried up what little milk she had left. The crying grew louder, more insistent. "Someone make her quiet, that child." Thomas Matthews stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is a respectable auction." A man Rachel didn't recognize, burly with hands like ham hocks, started toward the platform. "I'll quiet it for you," he growled, raising his hand. That's when the voice cut through the chaos, deep and steady as distant thunder. "Don't touch her." The crowd parted, and Rachel saw him for the first time. He stood apart from the others, as he always had, according to the whispers that followed him through town. Johnson Hartley was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard labor and a face that might have been carved from the red rocks that dotted the landscape. His mother had been Cheyenne, they said, and it showed in his high cheekbones and the bronze tint to his skin that no amount of frontier living could give a white man. His dark hair fell past his collar, and his clothes, while clean, were simple worn leather and rough homespun. "I'll buy her," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority as before. The square erupted. Laughter, harsh and mocking, mixed with gasps of outrage. "The half-breed thinks he can bid," someone shouted. "Savage wants himself a white woman." Go back to the reservation. Indian. Johnson Hartley didn't flinch. He walked forward with measured steps, reaching into his coat to pull out a leather pouch. The crowd's jeers grew louder, more vicious, but he continued until he stood before the auctioneer's table. $50, he said, setting the pouch down with a soft clink of coins. The auctioneer looked uncertain, glancing between Johnson and the Matthews brothers. Now, Mr. Hartley, I'm not sure. 75, Randall Carlson's voice cracked like a whip. His face had gone red, whether from anger or shame at being outbid by a mixed-blood man. Rachel couldn't tell. Johnson reached into another pocket, producing a second pouch. $100. The crowd fell silent. It was more than many of them saw in a year, more than the price of a good horse or a dozen head of cattle. The savages got money, someone whispered. Probably stole it. Blood money from scalping, more like. But Rachel saw something else in that moment. She saw the way Johnson's jaw tightened at their words, but didn't respond. She saw how he kept his eyes on the auctioneer, not once looking at her with the hungry gaze of the other bidders. And she saw, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was her only chance. Randall Carlson was sputtering now, his face purple. 125. Johnson didn't hesitate. 200. The amount was staggering. The auctioneer's hands shook as he looked between the two men. Mr. Carlson, do I hear? This is preposterous! Randall slammed his fist on the table. You can't let a half-breed. Money's money, the auctioneer said weakly. He seemed to have found his spine, perhaps motivated by the thought of his commission. 200 going once, going twice. Wait, Thomas Matthews stepped forward. There must be rules about who can bid. Surely a savage can't. The man's money is good. A new voice interrupted. Sheriff Ben Morrison, no relation to Jake, had been watching from the courthouse steps. He was a fair man, as frontier lawmen went, and he'd seen enough. If Hartley's got the funds, he can bid same as anyone. The gavel came down. Sold to Mr. Johnson Hartley for $200. The crowd exploded again, but Rachel barely heard them. Her legs finally gave out, and she sank to her knees on the platform, still clutching her crying daughter. Through blurred vision, she saw Johnson approaching, saw him stop at the edge of the platform and extend his hand. It was a work-worn hand, calloused and strong, but he held it out palm up. Waiting, not grabbing, not demanding, waiting for her to choose. With her free hand trembling like a leaf in a storm, Rachel reached out and took it. His grip was warm and steady, and he helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness. Can you walk? He asked quietly. His voice meant for her ears alone. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Then we should go. He helped her down from the platform, keeping his body between her and the crowd as they pushed through. She heard the slurs, the threats, felt spittle land on her dress. But Johnson never wavered, never hurried, just kept that steady pace toward where his wagon waited at the edge of the square. It was a simple farm wagon, sturdy and clean, with a pair of matched bay horses that stood calmly despite the commotion. He helped her up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away, Rachel looked back once at the crowd. Some were still shouting, shaking their fists. Randall Carlson stood with his arms crossed, his eyes following them with a look that promised this wasn't over. Thomas and James Matthews were already at the auctioneer's table, collecting their money. Then Johnson clicked to the horses, and Cedar Ridge began to fall away behind them. The baby had finally quieted, exhausted from crying, and lay limp in Rachel's arms. She realized she was shaking, whether from cold or shock or relief. She couldn't tell. They rode in silence for a long while, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves on the dirt road. Finally, when the town was just a smudge on the horizon, Rachel found her voice. Why? It came out as barely a whisper. Johnson glanced at her, then back at the road. "Because I see a woman," he said simply. "A mother, not property." Rachel felt tears on her cheeks. Didn't remember starting to cry. For months, she'd been nothing but a burden, a problem, a thing to be dealt with. And now this stranger, this man they called Savage, had seen her as human. She held her daughter closer and let the tears fall, not knowing what lay ahead, but knowing it had to be better than what lay behind. The wagon wheels found their rhythm on the rutted trail leading away from Cedar Ridge, each turn taking them deeper into the vast expanse of prairie and scattered pine. The spring air carried the scent of wet earth and early wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and prairie roses dotting the landscape with splashes of color against the endless brown and green. Rachel held her daughter close, stealing glances at the man beside her who drove in steady silence. Johnson Hartley handled the horses with the quiet confidence of someone who understood animals better than most people understood their own kin. His hands on the reins were sure but gentle, and when one of the bays tossed its head at a jackrabbit darting across the path, he merely made a soft clicking sound that seemed to calm the creature instantly. The baby stirred in Rachel's arms, making small mewing sounds that sent a spike of panic through her chest. She had so little milk left, and the child hadn't fed properly in 2 days. She tried to adjust her position, to offer what comfort she could, but exhaustion made her movements clumsy. "There's a canteen under the seat," Johnson said without looking at her. "Water's fresh from this morning." Rachel found it, a battered military canteen that had seen better days but was clean and full. She wet her finger and let the baby suck on it, which seemed to provide some temporary relief. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, eyes still on the trail ahead. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. Rachel's threadbare shawl, which had seemed barely adequate in town, now felt stifling. She was acutely aware of her appearance, the unwashed dress, the dirt under her fingernails, the way her hair hung limp and tangled despite her efforts to pin it back. What must he think of her? This man who'd paid a fortune for... What exactly? "Not much further," Johnson said, as if reading her growing anxiety. The trail wound through a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering secrets in the breeze, before opening onto a small valley. There, nestled against a rise that provided shelter from the north wind, stood a cabin. It was built of logs, sturdy and well-chinked, with a stone chimney that spoke of permanence. A lean-to barn sat nearby, along with a corral that held a few horses and a milk cow. Chickens scratched in the dirt near the cabin, and a kitchen garden showed the first green shoots of spring vegetables. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, real, cared for, more than Rachel had dared hope for. Johnson pulled the wagon up to the cabin and set the brake. He climbed down first, then came around to her side, offering his hand again. This time she took it without hesitation, though her legs trembled as they found the ground. "Come inside," he said. "You need food and rest." The cabin's interior was simple but clean. One large room served as kitchen and living space, with a smaller room visible through a doorway. A bedroom, she supposed. The furniture was handmade, but skillfully crafted: a table and 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, shelves lined with dishes and preserves. Everything spoke of a solitary life, but not an impoverished one. Johnson moved to the stove, stirring up the banked coals and adding wood. Soon he had water heating in a pot, from a cupboard. He produced a loaf of bread, only a day old by the look of it, and a jar of preserves. From a crock in the corner, he ladled out some kind of stew into a smaller pot to warm. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. "Please." Rachel sank into the chair, the baby fussing weakly in her arms. She watched as this man, this stranger, who now apparently owned her, moved about his kitchen with surprising domesticity. Within minutes, he'd set before her a bowl of venison stew, thick with vegetables and fragrant with herbs, alongside bread slathered with blackberry preserves. "Eat," he said. Slowly at first. When did you last have a proper meal? Rachel couldn't remember. The Matthews brothers had given her scraps, grudgingly, claiming she wasn't earning her keep. She picked up the spoon with a shaking hand and took a small sip of the stew. The flavor exploded on her tongue, so rich and warming that tears pricked her eyes again. "The baby," she began, but Johnson was already moving. From somewhere he produced a cup and a clean cloth. "Goat's milk," he said, pouring from a pitcher he'd fetched from what must be a root cellar. "Thinned with water. Not as good as mother's milk, but it'll do until yours comes back. You need to eat and drink first. Can't feed a baby if you're starving yourself." Rachel looked at him then. Really looked. His face was weathered, but not old, perhaps 35 to her 23. The native blood showed clearly in his features. But there was something else, too. A kindness in his dark eyes that belied the harsh words the townspeople threw at him. She ate slowly, as he'd suggested, while he showed her how to soak the cloth in the warm goat's milk and let the baby suckle from it. Her daughter latched on eagerly, and for the first time in days, fed without crying. "What's her name?" Johnson asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Clara," Rachel said. "After my mother—" He nodded. "Good name, strong name." They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence while Rachel finished her meal and Clara drank her fill. Finally. The baby's eyes drooped closed, milk drunk and content. "There's the bedroom through there," Johnson said, standing. "You and Clara take it. I'll bed down out here." Rachel looked up sharply. "But it's your—" "You need proper rest, both of you. There's water for washing in the pitcher, and—" He looked almost embarrassed. "I traded for some women's things a while back, fabric and such. They're in the trunk at the foot of the bed. Use what you need." He turned to go outside, probably to tend the animals, but Rachel's voice stopped him. "Mr. Hartley. Johnson," he corrected gently. "Just Johnson." "Johnson?" The name felt strange on her tongue. "I need to know what you expect from this arrangement." He turned back, his expression unreadable. "I expect you to rest, to heal, to care for your daughter. When you're stronger, if you want to help around the place, that would be welcome. But you're not a servant here. Mrs. Matthews." "Rachel," she said softly. "Just Rachel." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Rest, Rachel. Everything else can wait." That first night, Rachel lay in the unfamiliar bed with Clara nestled beside her, listening to the sounds of the cabin. She could hear Johnson moving about in the main room, the quiet scrape of a chair, the soft murmur as he spoke to the dog she'd noticed sleeping by the fire, an old hound with a gray muzzle and patient eyes. The bed was comfortable, with a good mattress and clean quilts that smelled of cedar. The trunk at its foot had indeed contained women's things, lengths of calico and muslin, thread and needles, even some store-bought soap wrapped in paper. Why a bachelor would have such things, she couldn't guess. She should have been terrified, she realized. She was alone in the wilderness with a strange man who'd bought her like livestock, but instead, she felt safe. For the first time since William's death, truly safe. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Clara was still sleeping, so Rachel washed quickly in the basin and tried to make herself presentable. Her dress was beyond help, but she'd found a comb in the trunk and managed to work the worst tangles from her hair. Johnson was at the stove when she emerged, and he'd set 2 places at the table. "I should be cooking for you," Rachel said. "It's only right." "Nothing about this is about what's right by town standards." Johnson interrupted gently. "Coffee." As they ate breakfast, eggs from his hens, bacon, more of that good bread, Rachel found herself studying him again. His hands bore old scars, and she noticed one ran up from his collar along his neck. The hands of a man who'd known violence but chose gentleness instead. "I can work," she said suddenly. "I'm a good cook, and I can sew, tend garden, Help with the animals. I won't be a burden." Johnson set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "You're not a burden. You're a woman who's had a hard run of luck. World's full of people who take advantage of that. I'm not one of them." "Then why?" Rachel asked again. "Why spend so much money on strangers?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. Remembering, "My mother was 15 when a group of soldiers rescued her from her village, brought her to Fort Laramie to civilize her. She ended up in much the same position you were in yesterday, being sold to the highest bidder. My father bought her, gave her a choice. She chose to stay, chose to marry him eventually, but it was her choice. She taught me that everyone deserves that, a choice." He stood abruptly, as if he'd said too much. "I need to check the stock. Take your time with breakfast." Alone again. Rachel touched the small wooden locket she wore, the one thing the Matthews brothers hadn't taken. Inside was a lock of William's hair, a reminder of better days. But now, looking around this simple, sturdy cabin, she wondered if perhaps the best days weren't behind her after all. Through the window, she could see Johnson in the corral, talking low to one of the horses as he brushed its coat. The morning sun caught the blue-black shine of his hair, and his movements were unhurried, peaceful. This was a man who'd made his peace with solitude, who'd built something good despite what the world thought of him. Rachel stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes. If he wouldn't let her repay his kindness with servitude, then she'd do it with partnership. She'd help make this place a home, not because she had to, but because she chose to. For the first time in months, Rachel Matthews allowed herself to hope. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm as natural as breathing. Spring deepened into early summer, and with it, Clara bloomed like the wildflowers that carpeted the meadow beyond the cabin. Her thin cries gave way to gurgling laughter. Her pinched face filled out into rosy cheeks and bright eyes that tracked movement with alert curiosity. Johnson had fashioned a cradle from pine wood, spending evenings by the fire carving delicate flowers into its sides. When Rachel protested that he was doing too much, he merely shrugged and said, "Idle hands make for a restless mind." She noticed he was careful with his knife work, each cut deliberate and sure, creating roses and morning glories that seemed to bloom from the wood itself. Clara loved the cradle, but she loved Johnson's other creations even more. He carved a succession of toys, a horse with legs that moved, a bird with spread wings, a tiny spoon just the right size for her grasping fingers. When he presented each one, he did so almost shyly, leaving them where Rachel would find them rather than handing them over directly. "She's taken with you," Rachel said one afternoon, watching Clara reach for Johnson as he passed by her blanket on the floor. The baby gurgled and kicked her legs, clearly demanding attention. Johnson paused, then slowly lowered himself to sit cross-legged beside the blanket. Clara immediately grabbed for his offered finger, pulling it toward her mouth with determined enthusiasm. "She's not particular," he said, but Rachel caught the soft look in his eyes as the baby gnawed contentedly on his knuckle. "Anyone would do." "That's not true." Rachel set aside the shirt she was mending, one of his worn through at the elbows from hard labor. "She cries when strangers come near, but with you—" It was true. They'd discovered this when Martha Coleman, the midwife from town, had made her way out to the cabin. The older woman had arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, her weathered face creased with concern. "Had to see for myself," she'd announced, pushing past Johnson at the door. "Whole town's talking about what that man did to you, buying you like cattle. Are you safe? Child, is the baby well?" Rachel had assured her they were both fine, more than fine, but Clara had taken an instant dislike to the stranger. She'd wailed inconsolably until Johnson had returned from the barn, whereupon she'd settled immediately. Martha had stayed for tea, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the cabin's comfortable interior, Rachel's improving health and Clara's obvious contentment. Before leaving, She'd pulled Rachel aside. "He's a good man," she'd said quietly. "Known him since he came to these parts 10 years ago. His mother's people cast him out for being half white. White folks won't accept him for being half Cheyenne. But he's never given anyone cause for complaint, except those who can't see past his bloodline." "Why are you telling me this?" Rachel had asked. Martha's eyes had been kind, but worried. "Because there's folks in town who won't let this be. Randall Carlson's been running his mouth, saying terrible things. And that no-good sheriff's deputy Clay Hutchins has been making noises about checking on the welfare of a white woman in a heathen's hands. You be careful." That warning echoed in Rachel's mind now, as she watched Johnson gently extract his finger from Clara's grip and replace it with the carved horse. The baby immediately began exploring this new treasure with her mouth. "Everything tastes better when you're that age," he observed, rising to his feet with the fluid grace she'd come to associate with him. He moved like the mountain cats that sometimes cried in the distance at night, deliberate, aware, never wasted motion. The sound of approaching horses broke the afternoon peace. Johnson was at the window in an instant, his body tensing in a way that made Rachel's heart skip. "Who is it?" she asked, already gathering Clara into her arms. "Deputy Hutchins," Johnson said, his voice carefully neutral. "And 2 others. Stay inside." He went out, closing the door firmly behind him. Rachel moved to the window, holding Clara close as she peered through the curtain Johnson's mother had made years ago. Beautiful work with beaded edges that caught the light. Clay Hutchins sat his horse like a man who enjoyed looking down on others. He was young for a deputy, maybe 25, with pale eyes and a weak chin that he tried to hide with patchy whiskers. His companions were men Rachel recognized from town. Dan Morrison, Jake's brother, and Pete Sawyer, both known for drinking too much and working too little. "Afternoon. Hartley," Clay said, not bothering to touch his hat. "Come to check on the woman and child. Make sure they're being treated proper." "They're well," Johnson replied, standing relaxed but ready, hands loose at his sides. "I'll be the judge of that. Man like you, taking a white woman and baby." Clay let the implication hang. "Well, concerned citizens have a right to be worried." Mrs. Matthews is free to leave whenever she chooses," Johnson said evenly. "I've told her as much." "Have you now?" Clay leaned forward in his saddle. "And where would she go? Exactly. You've probably got her too scared to run. Probably told her what you'd do if she tried." Rachel had heard enough, despite Johnson's instruction to stay inside. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Clara balanced on her hip. "Mister, Hartley has been nothing but kind to us," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm here by choice. Deputy—" Clay's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance. The clean dress one she'd sewn from the fabric in the trunk, her neatly braided hair, the healthy color in her cheeks. Clara, plump and content, chose that moment to laugh and reach for Johnson. "See how the child reaches for him?" Dan Morrison sneered. "Probably witchcraft. Indians got ways of bewitching folks." "The only witchcraft here," Rachel said sharply, "is how a man who calls himself Christian can stand by while a woman and baby are put up for auction, then complain when someone shows them charity." Clay's face reddened. "Now see here." "No, you see—" Rachel stepped forward, surprising herself with her boldness. "I was starving. My baby was starving. Not one of you concerned citizens lifted a finger to help when the Matthews brothers treated me worse than their livestock. But now that I'm safe and fed and cared for, now you're concerned." "You're living in sin with a half-breed," Pete Sawyer spat. "It ain't natural." "What's unnatural?" Johnson said quietly. "Is 3 grown men riding out here to harass a woman and child. I think you've seen what you came to see. Time to go." "You threatening us, Indian." Clay's hand moved toward his gun. Johnson didn't move, but something in his stillness changed, became dangerous. "I'm suggesting you remember your lawmen, not vigilantes. Sheriff Morrison is a fair man. I doubt he'd approve of his deputy intimidating folks without cause. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Clara, bless her innocent heart, chose that moment to blow a spit bubble and giggle, completely undermining the tension. Even Pete Sawyer's mouth twitched toward a smile before he caught himself. "This ain't over," Clay said finally, wheeling his horse around. "Decent folks won't stand for this arrangement." They rode off in a cloud of dust, and Rachel realized she was trembling. Johnson touched her elbow gently, guiding her back inside. "You shouldn't have come out," he said, but there was no real reproach in it. "They made me angry." Rachel sank into the rocking chair, holding Clara close, acting like they care about propriety when they were ready to let us starve. Johnson moved to the stove, his answer to most upsets being to make tea. It was one of many small things she'd learned about him. He preferred tea to coffee in the evening. He sang soft Cheyenne lullabies to the horses when he thought no one was listening, and he had a weakness for honey cakes that she'd discovered when she made a batch and found half gone by morning. "They'll be back," he said, setting a steaming cup before her. "Clay Hutchins has ambitions. Thinks if he can prove I'm mistreating you, it'll make him look good to voters come election time." "Then we'll face them when they come," Rachel said firmly. "This is my home now." The word hung between them. Home. She hadn't meant to say it, but it was true. Somewhere in the quiet rhythm of their days, this cabin had become more home than anywhere she'd lived with William. There was peace here, and purpose, and the slow-growing warmth of what friendship partnership. That night, as had become her custom, Rachel brought her mending to sit by the fire while Johnson worked on a new piece of furniture, a high chair for Clara. The summer evenings were long, and they'd fallen into comfortable silence punctuated by Clara's babbling and the old hound's contented sighs. "I found your mother's locket today," Rachel said suddenly, "in the drawer with the good linen. It's beautiful." Johnson's hands stilled on the wood. "She loved wildflowers," he said after a moment. "Used to press them in books, between pieces of glass. Said they were proof that beauty could grow anywhere, even in hard ground." Rachel touched her own locket, thinking of William. "She sounds wise." "She was," he resumed sanding. Long, smooth strokes. "Died when I was 16. Fever took her quick. My father followed 2 years later. Broken heart, I think, though the doctor called it pneumonia." "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "Long time ago, but she'd have liked you. Would have liked seeing a woman and child in this house again, making use of her things." Rachel felt warmth bloom in her chest. "The fabric in the trunk, was it hers?" "No." Johnson looked almost embarrassed. "I traded for it last winter. Don't know why. Just seemed like the house needed it. Like maybe someday—" He trailed off, focusing intently on his work. "Like maybe someday someone would need it," Rachel finished silently. Had he sensed, somehow, that fate would bring them together, or had he simply been a lonely man hoping for a future that included more than solitude? Clara yawned hugely from her basket, and Rachel rose to prepare her for bed. As she passed Johnson's chair, she paused. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing up to them today, for everything." He looked up at her, and for a moment their eyes held. "You stood up for yourself," he said. "That took courage." "I'm learning," Rachel admitted. "Being here, feeling safe, it's teaching me to be brave again." Later, after Clara was settled and Rachel had retired to the bedroom, she heard Johnson bank the fire and settle onto his pallet in the main room. The old hound groaned and repositioned himself. And then the cabin fell quiet, except for the settling of logs and the distant cry of an owl. Rachel lay awake thinking about courage, about choices, about the strange turns life could take. 6 weeks ago, she'd stood on an auction block, convinced her life was ending. Now she lay in a comfortable bed, her belly full, her child safe, under the protection of a man the world called savage, but who showed more Christianity in his daily actions than any churchgoer she'd known. Through the window, stars wheeled overhead in the vast Montana sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the moon, and another answered. The sound should have frightened her, but instead it seemed right. Natural wild things calling to each other across the darkness, finding their own kind in the wilderness. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. Fresh horse tracks by the creek where Rachel often went to wash clothes. They weren't from Johnson's horses. He'd taught her to recognize their hoof prints, just as he'd taught her which berries were safe to eat and how to read the weather and the behavior of birds. She mentioned the tracks that evening as they sat down to supper. Johnson's face didn't change, but his hand paused for a fraction of a second as he reached for the bread. "Could be anyone," he said carefully. "Drifters, maybe. Hunters." But they both knew better. The tracks had circled the washing spot, had stopped where someone would have a clear view of the cabin. Someone had been watching. 2 nights later, Johnson came back from town with blood on his shirt and a cut over his left eye. He moved stiffly, favoring his right side, though he tried to hide it as he unhitched the horses. Rachel was at his side immediately, Clara sleeping in her sling across her chest. "What happened?" "Nothing to worry about." But he let her lead him inside, let her push him into a chair and examine the cut. His knuckles were scraped raw, and when she helped him remove his shirt, she found bruises blooming across his ribs. "This is Randall Carlson's doing," she said, heating water and gathering clean cloths. Johnson didn't deny it. "Ran into him and some friends outside Morrison's store. They had words to say about our arrangement." "And you had words back?" Rachel asked, gently cleaning the cut above his eye. "Not words. No." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, then turned into a wince as she pressed too hard. "But I made my position clear." As she tended his wounds, Rachel was struck by the strange intimacy of the moment. She'd cared for William when he was sick, of course, but that had been different, duty-bound and distant, even in their marriage bed. This felt like something else entirely. Johnson sat still under her ministrations, his eyes closed, trusting her completely. "There," she said finally, tying off the bandage around his ribs. "You'll be sore for a few days, but nothing's broken." "Had worse," he said, then caught her hand as she turned away. "Rachel, they said things about you, about Clara. I couldn't let it stand." She looked down at their joined hands, his so dark and scarred, hers pale and work-roughened but healing. "What kind of things?" "Doesn't matter. They're wrong." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, gentle as a whisper. "You're a good woman, a good mother. Don't let anyone tell you different." That night, Rachel lay awake listening to the sounds of the cabin and thinking about the feel of his hand on hers. Outside, a storm was building, thunder rumbling in the distance like wagon wheels over rough ground. Through her partially open door, she could see Johnson sitting in his chair by the banked fire, rifle across his knees, standing guard. The storm broke near midnight, rain hammering on the roof like fists. Clara woke crying, frightened by the thunder, and Rachel soothed her as best she could. But the baby wouldn't settle, her cries growing more frantic with each lightning flash. She was surprised when Johnson appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by a flicker of lightning. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Clara. Rachel nodded, and he crossed to them, moving carefully in the darkness. To her amazement, he began to hum, a low, rhythmic melody she'd heard him use with the horses. Clara's cries stuttered, then softened to whimpers. "Old Cheyenne song," he explained quietly, taking Clara with practiced ease. "My mother sang it during storms. Says the thunder is just the sky buffalo running home to their children." He walked slowly around the small room, humming and swaying gently. Clara watched him with wide eyes, one small fist clutching at his shirt. Within minutes, she was asleep. "You're good with her," Rachel whispered. "Had younger cousins before." He didn't finish, But she understood. Before his mother's people cast him out, before he became a man caught between two worlds, welcome in neither. He settled Clara back in her cradle, tucking the blanket around her with infinite care. As he straightened, another flash of lightning illuminated his face, and Rachel saw something there that made her heart skip, a longing so deep and carefully hidden that it took her breath away. "Johnson," she said, not knowing what she meant to say next. But he was already moving toward the door. "Storm's passing. You should sleep." The next morning dawned clear and washed clean. Rachel woke to find fresh wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table, Indian paintbrush and prairie roses, still dewed with rain. Johnson was already gone to check the stock, but his thoughtfulness lingered in those bright blooms. As she prepared breakfast, movement outside caught her eye. A rider was approaching, but not from the direction of town. This one came from the north, following the old native trail that Johnson had told her about. The rider was a woman, Rachel realized with surprise. An older native woman riding a paint pony with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. Johnson emerged from the barn to meet her, and Rachel watched as the woman dismounted and they spoke in what must be Cheyenne. After a few minutes, Johnson led her toward the cabin. "Rachel," he said as they entered, "this is Mary White Dove. She was my mother's friend." Mary White Dove had a face carved by wind and weather, but her dark eyes were kind as they studied Rachel. She said something in Cheyenne to Johnson, who looked uncomfortable. "She wants to know if you're my wife," he translated reluctantly. Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks. Tell her I'm under his protection." Mary White Dove didn't need the translation. She smiled, a knowing expression that made Rachel blush harder, then turned her attention to Clara, who was watching from her basket with bright curiosity. The older woman stayed for several hours, speaking with Johnson in a mixture of Cheyenne and English. Rachel caught fragments, concerns about white men causing trouble, warnings about Randall Carlson, mentions of other mixed-blood families who'd faced similar harassment. Before she left, Mary White Dove pressed something into Rachel's hand, a small beaded pouch on a leather cord. She spoke in careful English. "For protection, for you and the little one. My friend's son. He is a good man, but good men need good women to guard their hearts." After she rode away, Johnson seemed restless, pacing the cabin like a caged wolf. Finally, he turned to Rachel, who was examining the beautiful beadwork on the pouch. "She brought news. Carlson's been talking to the territorial judge, trying to claim I'm holding you against your will. Says a white woman couldn't possibly choose to live with." He gestured at himself, unable or unwilling to say the words. "Then we'll tell the judge otherwise," Rachel said firmly. "It's not that simple. Carlson has influence, money, and the judge—" Johnson's jaw tightened. "Judge Barrett lost a brother to Cheyenne raiders 15 years ago. He's not inclined to be sympathetic to anyone with native blood." Rachel set down the pouch and crossed to him. Clara balanced on her hip. "Then what do we do?" "You could leave," Johnson said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Take Clara. Go somewhere else. I have money saved. You could start fresh without this shadow hanging over you." The suggestion hit Rachel like a physical blow. "Is that what you want for us to leave?" "I want you safe." His voice was rough. "You and Clara both. And as long as you're here, with me, there will be those who—" "Stop!" Rachel reached out, placed her free hand on his arm. "Johnson, look at me." He did, reluctantly, and she saw the pain there, the expectation of abandonment. "We're not leaving," she said firmly. "This is our home. You gave us that, you gave us choice, and I choose to stay." "Rachel." "No, you listen now." She drew herself up, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "For months after William died, I was nothing, less than nothing, a burden, a problem, something to be sold off. You gave me back my dignity. You showed Clara kindness. You've asked nothing of us but to heal, to be safe. I won't repay that by running at the first sign of trouble." Johnson's hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his arm. They could make things very difficult. "Then we face it together." She managed a small smile. "Besides, where else would I find someone to carve toys for Clara and leave flowers on my table?" That startled a laugh from him. Short, but genuine. "Stubborn woman. Learning from the best," she countered. "You stood between 3 men and me without flinching. The least I can do is stand beside you against gossip and legal threats." That evening, as Rachel settled Clara for the night, she found herself humming the Cheyenne storm song. Through the doorway, she could see Johnson at the table, writing a letter to a lawyer in the territorial capital. He'd said, someone who might help if Carlson pushed his case. The beaded pouch Mary White Dove had given her lay on the dresser, catching the last rays of sunlight through the window. Protection, the woman had said, but Rachel thought perhaps the real protection wasn't in beads and leather, but in the choice to stand together against whatever storms might come. Outside, nightbirds began their evening chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. The sound no longer seemed lonely to Rachel. Instead, it spoke of wildness and freedom, of creatures that chose their own paths regardless of what the civilized world thought proper. She touched the window glass, looking out at the vast sky scattered with the first stars. Behind her, Clara slept peacefully in her cradle, in the next room. Johnson worked by lamplight, planning their defense against those who would tear apart what they were building. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a young bride, but perhaps, Rachel thought, the best lives were the ones you never saw coming, the ones that found you when you thought all was lost and showed you that you were stronger than you ever knew. The tension in Cedar Ridge grew thick as summer honey. Every trip to town for supplies became an ordeal of whispered conversations that died when Johnson entered a store, of women pulling their children close when Rachel passed, of men who spat in the dirt and muttered words just loud enough to be heard but not quite loud enough to demand response. The rumors spread like wildfire in dry grass. Some said Johnson had bewitched Rachel with native magic. Others claimed she'd lost her virtue and her mind, choosing to live in sin with a half-breed rather than maintain her dignity as a widow. The Matthews brothers added fuel to the fire, speaking loudly in the saloon about their poor dead brother turning in his grave at his wife's shameful behavior. Rachel bore it all with her chin high, though each cutting remark left invisible scars. She'd grown stronger in the months at the cabin, good food and rest filling out her gaunt frame. But the emotional toll was harder to hide. Johnson noticed. He noticed everything, and his jaw would tighten when she returned from town with that particular stillness that meant someone had been cruel. "You don't have to go," he said one evening after a particularly difficult trip. Rachel had overheard Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, telling her friends that it was a tragedy what that poor baby was being exposed to, living in such an ungodly situation. "Yes, I do," Rachel replied, folding the fabric she'd purchased with determined precision. Hiding would only make them think they're right. Besides, Clara needs things. We need things. Johnson watched her from his seat by the fire, whittling what would become a wooden duck for Clara. "There are other towns, other places we could go." "This is our home," Rachel said firmly, then softer. "This is your home. Your parents are buried here. Your mother's spirit walks these hills. I won't be the reason you leave." He set down his knife, studying her with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "My mother would say home isn't a place. It's the people who choose to stand beside you." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither quite dared to examine too closely. Clara chose that moment to wake from her nap, her cheerful babbling breaking the tension. She was trying to crawl now, pushing herself up on chubby arms and rocking back and forth with determination. Johnson moved to the floor, encouraging her efforts with gentle words and the wooden duck as incentive, watching them. Rachel felt that dangerous warmth bloom in her chest again. The feeling she tried so hard to suppress because it seemed like a betrayal of William's memory, even though their marriage had been more duty than love. But William had never looked at Clara the way Johnson did, with such patience and delight. William had seen the baby as another mouth to feed, another burden in their struggling existence. Johnson saw her as a gift, a small miracle to be cherished and protected. The sound of multiple horses approaching shattered the peaceful moment. Johnson was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with that fluid grace that still caught Rachel off guard. "Stay inside," he said, reaching for the rifle that always stood ready by the door. But Rachel recognized one of the horses, Martha Coleman's sturdy mare. She placed a restraining hand on Johnson's arm. "It's Martha, but she's not alone." 3 riders dismounted in the yard. Martha, Sheriff Ben Morrison himself, and, surprisingly, Reverend Thomas Fuller from the Methodist Church. Johnson stepped onto the porch, rifle held loosely but ready. Rachel followed, Clara on her hip. "Afternoon. Johnson," Sheriff Morrison said, touching his hat. He was a big man, fair-haired and fair-minded, one of the few in town who treated Johnson with consistent respect. "Mrs. Matthews, mind if we come in? Got some things to discuss." Johnson glanced at Rachel, who nodded. Soon they were all crowded into the cabin's main room, cups of coffee distributed by Rachel's hands. The Reverend looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around as if expecting to see evidence of heathenism in every corner. Instead, he saw a clean, well-ordered home with Clara's toys scattered about and Rachel's sewing basket by the rocking chair. "I'll get straight to it," Sheriff Morrison said. "Randall Carlson's been making a powerful fuss about you two. He's got Judge Barrett's ear, claiming Mrs. Matthews is being held against her will, that she's not in her right mind to make proper decisions." "That's ridiculous," Rachel said hotly. "Maybe so, but Carlson's got influence and money to back his claims." The sheriff's expression was grim. "He's pushing for a formal inquiry. Wants the court to remove you and the baby from Johnson's custody, place you somewhere appropriate, which, knowing Carlson, means under his protection." Rachel's blood ran cold. She knew exactly what Carlson's protection would mean. "That's why we're here," Martha interjected. "Ben and I have been talking to folks, trying to gather support. Reverend Fuller has agreed to speak on your behalf if it comes to a hearing." All eyes turned to the Reverend, who cleared his throat nervously. I've struggled with this situation," he admitted. "The appearance of impropriety, the mixing of races. It goes against much of what I've been taught, but Mrs. Coleman has helped me see that Christian charity takes many forms." He looked directly at Johnson. "I've watched you from afar these past years. Mr. Hartley, you keep to yourself. Cause no trouble. Help your neighbors when storms damage their fences or predators threaten their stock. You ask for nothing in return. That speaks to character, regardless of bloodline." "More importantly," Martha added, "I've seen how Rachel and Clara have thrived here. That baby was near death when she arrived. Now look at her, fat and happy as a little butterball. And Rachel." She reached over to squeeze Rachel's hand. "You've found yourself again, haven't you, dear?" Rachel nodded, not trusting her voice. "The thing is," Sheriff Morrison continued, "if this goes to a formal hearing, you'll need to present your case properly. Judge Barrett's not an easy man, and he'll be predisposed against you. Johnson, you'll need character witnesses, evidence of a stable home environment, and—" He hesitated. "And what?" Johnson asked. "It would help considerably if you two were legally married," the Reverend said quietly. "A proper marriage would remove the question of moral impropriety. It would make it much harder for Carlson to claim Mrs. Matthews as being corrupted or coerced." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel felt heat flood her cheeks and carefully didn't look at Johnson. Clara, oblivious to the tension, reached for the sheriff's shiny badge, babbling happily. That's not why I brought her here, Johnson said finally, his voice low and controlled. I didn't buy her to make her my wife. She's free to choose her own path. We know that, Martha said gently. But the court might not see it that way. They'll see an unmarried woman living with a man who paid money for her. In their eyes, that's only one step removed from... She didn't finish, but they all understood. We'll think on it. Rachel managed to say, "Thank you all for coming, for caring enough to warn us." After the visitors left, the cabin felt too small, too quiet. Johnson stood by the window, watching their dust trail disappear. Rachel busied herself with preparing dinner, though her hands shook as she peeled potatoes. "We don't have to," Johnson said suddenly. We'll find another way to fight this." Rachel set down the knife carefully. "And if there isn't another way, if marriage is the only thing that will keep Carlson from taking Clara and me..." He turned to face her, and she saw the struggle in his expression. "Then we do what we must to keep you safe. But Rachel, you deserve a real marriage, to someone of your choosing, not another arrangement born of necessity." "All marriages are arrangements of one sort or another," Rachel said, thinking of her union with William, born of her father's debts, and William's need for a wife to help with his farm. "At least this one would be honest. We respect each other. We work well together. Clara loves you." "And you?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, hanging in the air between them like morning mist. Rachel met his eyes steadily. "I trust you. I feel safe with you. She paused, searching for words that wouldn't reveal too much. "I can think of worse foundations for a marriage." Johnson crossed to her in 3 strides, taking her hands in his. "You deserve better than not worse. You deserve love. Rachel. Real love. The kind that makes you want to dance in the rain and sing to the stars. The kind my parents had." "Did your parents have that from the beginning?" Rachel asked softly. "Or did it grow from respect and trust and daily kindness?" He was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs tracing small circles on her palms. "My mother used to say that love was like her garden. You could plant seeds in good soil, tend them faithfully, and most times they'd grow into something beautiful. But you had to be willing to do the work, to weather the storms together." "Then let's plant seeds," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's see what grows." Johnson lifted one of her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her work-worn fingers. "Are you certain? Once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be the wife of a half-breed. Some doors will close to you forever." "Those doors were already closing," Rachel said. "I'm a widow who was sold at auction. My reputation was gone the moment I stood on that platform. But here, with you, here I have dignity, purpose, a future for Clara. That's worth more than all the social acceptance in the world." That night, as Rachel lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling, she thought about seeds and soil, about the different shapes love could take. Through her open door, she could see Johnson's silhouette as he sat by the dying fire, keeping watch as he did every night. Tomorrow they would go to town, would face the reverend and the legal documents that would bind them together in the eyes of the law. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, Rachel admitted what she hadn't dared say aloud, that somewhere between that first offered hand and this moment, she'd already chosen him in her heart. The law would only be catching up to what her soul already knew, that home wasn't just a place, but the person who stood guard while you slept, who carved toys for your daughter and left wildflowers on your table, who saw you not as property or burden, but simply as yourself. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain for the thirsty earth. Rachel smiled, remembering the Cheyenne song about sky buffalo running home to their children. Tomorrow would bring challenges, but tonight she was safe. Clara was loved, and hope grew like wildflowers in her heart. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the homestead as Rachel heard them coming, the thunder of hooves that she'd been dreading for days. She was in the garden, Clara playing in a basket beside her among the bean rows. When the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, her hands tightened on the hoe, knuckles white against the weathered wood. Johnson emerged from the barn where he'd been mending harnesses, his movements calm but alert. He'd heard them too. Without a word, he moved to stand between the approaching riders and the house, his presence solid as the mountains that rimmed the valley. They came like a dark wave. Randall Carlson at the lead on his black stallion, flanked by the Matthews brothers and 3 other men Rachel recognized as ranch hands from Carlson's spread. Behind them rode Deputy Clay Hutchins, trying to lend an air of authority to what was clearly a mob. Rachel scooped up Clara and moved to stand beside Johnson. She wouldn't cower in the house. Not this time. "Afternoon, Hartley," Carlson drawled as they reined up in a semicircle before the cabin. His pale eyes lingered on Rachel in a way that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Matthews, come to settle this matter once and for all." "Nothing to settle," Johnson replied evenly. "You're on my land. State your business or move along." Thomas Matthews spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Our business is collecting what's ours. My brother's widow and child don't belong with the likes of you." "I belong to no one," Rachel said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I'm a free woman, making my own choices." "Are you now?" Carlson's smile was cold. "Or has this savage twisted your mind with his heathen ways? Everyone knows Indians have powers, can make a person act against their nature." James Matthews nodded vigorously. "That's right. No decent white woman would choose this. You've bewitched her somehow." Johnson's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "The only power I have is the deed to this land and the right to ask you to leave it." "We're not going anywhere," Carlson said, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "Not without the woman and child. You see, we've been patient. Gave you time to come to your senses, Mrs. Matthews, but patience has run out." The other men dismounted as well, spreading out in a loose line. Rachel's heart hammered, but she lifted her chin and held Clara tighter. The baby, sensing the tension, began to fuss. "Deputy Hutchins." Johnson addressed the lawmen who remained mounted, looking uncomfortable. "Are you here in an official capacity?" Clay shifted in his saddle. "Just here to keep the peace. Make sure things don't get out of hand." "Seems to me things are already out of hand when 7 men ride onto private property making threats." "No threats," Carlson said smoothly. "Just concerned citizens looking after the welfare of a widow and orphan. Why don't you step aside? Hartley, this doesn't have to get unpleasant." "Everything about this is already unpleasant," Rachel snapped. "You men stood by while I was put on an auction block like livestock. Not one of you offered help when I was starving, but now that I'm safe and cared for, suddenly you're concerned." "You call this safe?" Thomas gestured wildly at the cabin. "Living in sin with a half-breed raising that innocent child in this den of iniquity." "This den of iniquity," Rachel's voice rose with anger, "has shown me more Christian kindness than any of your proper homes. Mr. Hartley saved us when you would have let us die." "Saved you for what?" Carlson stepped closer, and Johnson shifted subtly, placing himself more firmly between them. "To be a squaw, to warm his bed, and—" "Enough!" Johnson's voice cut like a blade. "You've said your piece. Now get off my land." "Or what?" One of Carlson's men, a thick-set fellow named Boyd, laughed harshly. "You'll take on all of us, even savages ain't that stupid." "He won't have to." The new voice made everyone turn. Sheriff Ben Morrison rode into the yard, accompanied by Reverend Fuller and, surprisingly, Judge Barrett himself. The judge was a stern-faced man in his 60s, gray-bearded and straight-backed in the saddle. "Gentlemen," the sheriff said mildly, though his hand rested on his pistol, "this looks like a situation that could get out of hand real quick. How about we all take a step back?" "Sheriff," Carlson recovered quickly, donning a mask of righteous concern. "We're just here about the welfare of Mrs. Matthews and her child. Surely the law has an interest in protecting white women from unfortunate situations. Judge Barrett dismounted slowly, his keen eyes taking in the scene. I received several petitions about this matter, he said. Seemed prudent to investigate personally rather than rely on hearsay. He approached Rachel, who stood her ground despite the trembling in her knees. Clara had gone quiet, watching the strangers with wide eyes. "Hey, Mrs. Matthews," the judge said formally. "Are you here of your own free will?" "I am, Your Honor. And the child, she appears well cared for." "She is Mr. Hartley has been nothing but kind to us both. He's provided food, shelter, safety, everything we lacked before." The judge's eyes moved to Johnson. "Mr. Hartley, I'm told you paid $200 at a public auction. What were your intentions?" Johnson met his gaze steadily. "To keep a woman and baby from being sold to men who would abuse them. Nothing more. Yet they remain in your household." "They're free to leave whenever they choose. I've made that clear from the first day." "Have you?" The judge turned back to Rachel. "If you wish to leave tomorrow, take your daughter and go. Would Mr. Hartley prevent you?" "No, Your Honor. He's offered to help us leave if that's what we wanted. Offered money to start over elsewhere." Rachel's voice grew stronger. "But this is our home now. We choose to stay." "Choose?" Carlson scoffed. "What choice does she have? Where would she go? You've compromised her reputation. Hartley, no decent place would have her now." "That's where you're wrong." Reverend Fuller spoke up, surprising everyone. "I have offered to help Mrs. Matthews relocate to my sister's boarding house in Denver if she wishes, a place for widows and women in difficult circumstances." She declined. Judge Barrett's eyebrows rose. "You declined such an offer, Mrs. Matthews?" "I did." Rachel lifted her chin. "Clara and I have a good home here. Why would we leave?" "Because it's improper," Thomas Matthews exploded. "A white woman living with her husband," Johnson interrupted calmly. The silence that followed was deafening. Carlson's face went purple. "What did you say?" Johnson reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded document. "Mrs. Matthews and I were married 3 days ago." Reverend Fuller performed the ceremony. Sheriff Morrison and his wife stood witness. The judge took the paper, examining it carefully. "This appears to be in order." He looked between Rachel and Johnson. "Though I must ask, was this marriage entered into freely by both parties?" "It was," Rachel said firmly. Before anyone could question further, she stepped forward, still holding Clara. "Your Honor, may I speak freely?" The judge nodded. "My first marriage was arranged by my father to settle debts. I was 16, knew nothing of the man I was to marry. I did my duty, kept his house, bore his child. When he died, his family cast me out without a penny, then put me on an auction block to recoup their losses." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "Mr. Hartley, my husband, bought my freedom. He asked nothing of me but to heal, to care for my child. He showed me kindness when the world showed me cruelty. If that's not a foundation for marriage, I don't know what is." "It's disgusting," Carlson spat. "A white woman degrading herself." "The only degradation I've suffered," Rachel interrupted, "was at the hands of so-called civilized men, men like you, Mr. Carlson, who saw me as something to own. My husband sees me as someone to respect." "Your husband," Carlson sneered the word, "is a half-breed savage who—" He never finished. Johnson moved faster than Rachel had ever seen him move, his fist connecting solidly with Carlson's jaw. The rancher stumbled back, blood streaming from his nose. "Johnson, no!" Rachel cried, but Boyd was already swinging at Johnson, who ducked and landed a blow to the man's stomach. "That's enough." Sheriff Morrison's pistol was out, pointed skyward. "Next man who throws a punch gets arrested." Carlson wiped blood from his face, eyes blazing with fury. You all saw that he attacked me." "I saw a man defending his wife's honor," Judge Barrett said dryly. "Something any husband would do." The judge's words seemed to take the wind from Carlson's sails. He looked around at his supporters, but even the Matthews brothers seemed uncertain now. "Your Honor," Deputy Hutchins spoke up nervously. "Surely there must be some law against this sort of union. No territorial law prohibits marriage between races." The judge replied, "Though I personally find it irregular." He fixed his stern gaze on Johnson and Rachel. "However, the law is clear. They are legally married. The woman is here by choice. The child appears healthy and well cared for. I see no grounds for intervention." "This isn't over," Carlson snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "You can't hide behind legal tricks forever. Hartley—" "No tricks," Johnson said quietly. "Just the truth. Now get off our land." One by one, the intruders mounted and rode away, Carlson shooting murderous glances over his shoulder. Only when the dust of their departure had settled did Rachel realize she was shaking. Sheriff Morrison holstered his weapon. "They'll be back, you know. Men like Carlson don't give up easy." "We'll be ready," Johnson said. Judge Barrett remounted his horse, then paused. "Mr. Hartley, I'll be frank. I don't approve of mixed marriages. Goes against the natural order, in my opinion. But the law's the law, and I've seen today that Mrs. Hartley speaks for herself." He touched his hat to Rachel. "Ma'am, take care of that baby." After the officials left, Rachel and Johnson stood alone in their yard. Clara, oblivious to the drama, had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, thumb in mouth. "You hit him," Rachel said softly. "He insulted you." Johnson flexed his bruised knuckles. "I won't stand for that. I can fight my own battles." "I know." He turned to face her fully. "You were magnificent. The way you stood up to them all." Rachel felt warmth bloom in her cheeks. "We stood up to them. Together." "Together," he agreed. Then, softer. "Wife." The word sent an unexpected shiver through her. They'd married for protection, for legal safety, but hearing him say it made something shift inside her chest. "We should go in," she said. "Clara needs her nap in her cradle." But neither moved. They stood there in the afternoon light, the dust still settling around them, and Rachel realized that something had changed. They'd drawn a line in the earth, declared themselves to the world. Whatever came next, they would face it not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as partners bound by choice. "No regrets?" Johnson asked quietly. Rachel looked at him, this man who'd saved her, who'd given her dignity and hope and a future, who just risked everything to defend her honor. "No regrets," she said, and meant it. The shot rang out just as Sheriff Morrison raised his hand to restore order. For a heartbeat. Nobody moved. Then Rachel saw the blood blooming across Johnson's shirt, saw him stagger back with surprise more than pain. "Johnson!" She rushed to him as he dropped to one knee, Clara crying in her arms at the sudden movement. "Nobody move." Sheriff Morrison had his pistol drawn, scanning the group. Who fired that shot? But chaos had already erupted. Carlson's men were reaching for their weapons, the Matthews brothers backing toward their horses, and Deputy Hutchins sat frozen in his saddle, face pale as parchment. "Wasn't none of us." "Sheriff Toe," Boyd protested, hands raised. "We're all right here in plain sight." A second shot cracked through the air, kicking up dust at the sheriff's feet. This time, they saw the smoke from the tree line beyond the barn. "Take cover," Morrison shouted. Johnson, despite his wound, pulled Rachel behind the water trough. His left arm hung useless, blood soaking his sleeve, but he shielded her and Clara with his body. "The house," he gritted through clenched teeth. "Get to the house." "Not without you." Rachel's free hand pressed against his wound, trying to stem the bleeding. Clara wailed, picking up on the fear and tension. More shots rang out. Judge Barrett's horse reared, nearly throwing him before he got it under control. Reverend Fuller dove behind a wagon wheel, praying loudly. "It's an ambush," someone shouted. Sheriff Morrison had taken position behind his horse. "Carlson, this you're doing." "Are you mad?" Carlson was crouched behind his own mount, genuine fear in his eyes. "Why would I shoot at you?" Another volley of gunfire erupted from the trees. This time, a return fire came from an unexpected source. Deputy Hutchins had dismounted and was shooting back, his face grim with determination. "Cover me!" he shouted to the sheriff. "I saw movement in those pines." It was then that Rachel spotted him, a lone rider breaking from the trees, rifle in hand, even at a distance. She recognized the worn leather vest, the distinctive gray horse. "It's Jake Morrison," she called out. "From the boarding house." The sheriff's face darkened. "My cousin, what in blazes?" Jake Morrison rode harder, firing wildly. His face was twisted with rage, and Rachel could smell the whiskey on him even from 30 yards away. "You ruined everything," he screamed, though whether at Johnson, Carlson, or the world in general wasn't clear. "She was supposed to be mine, I bid fair and square." "He's drunk as a skunk," Boyd muttered. "And dangerous," Sheriff Morrison replied grimly. He raised his voice. "Jake, put the gun down. You're shooting at lawmen." Jake's response was another wild shot that shattered a window in the cabin. Johnson grunted, trying to rise despite his wound. "Stay down," Rachel hissed, pressing him back. She could feel his blood warm on her hands, see the pain he was trying to hide. "Jake Morrison, you're under arrest," the sheriff shouted. "Drop your weapon." But Jake was beyond reason. He'd stopped his horse now, was reloading with shaking hands. "Carlson promised," he yelled. "Said if I helped run off the breed, the woman would need protection. Said I could—" Carlson's roar of outrage cut him off. "You lying drunk, I never care." "Enough." Judge Barrett's voice carried the authority of years on the bench. "Everyone calm down before more blood is shed." But Jake had finished reloading. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at Johnson and Rachel huddled behind the trough. Several things happened at once. Sheriff Morrison fired. Deputy Hutchins fired. Johnson, with his good arm, pulled Rachel and Clara flat to the ground. When the echoes died away, Jake Morrison lay sprawled in the dust, his horse galloping riderless toward the horizon. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sheriff Morrison walked slowly to his cousin's body, knelt beside it. When he rose, his face was stone. "He's dead." He looked at Carlson with cold eyes. "You want to explain what he meant about promises?" Carlson's face had gone from purple to pale. "The man was drunk, talking nonsense." "Maybe so," the sheriff said. "But drunk men often speak truths they'd keep hidden sober." He turned to his deputy. "Clay, I'm appointing you to take Jake's body back to town. Then I want you to go through his room at the boarding house. Every paper, every letter. Understood." Deputy Hutchins nodded, looking shaken but determined. Rachel realized he was younger than she'd thought. Maybe only 22 or 23. Too young to have seen such violence. "Now then," Sheriff Morrison continued. "Seems to me we have wounded here who need tending. Reverend, Judge, I'd appreciate if you'd ride back with Clay. Make sure there's no more trouble." Judge Barrett cleared his throat. "Sheriff, about what happened here." "What happened here," Morrison said firmly, "is a drunk man opened fire on peaceful citizens and lawmen. He was shot resisting arrest. That's what my report will say." The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I concur with your assessment, Sheriff." As the crowd began to disperse, Rachel helped Johnson to his feet. His face was gray with pain, but he managed to walk to the cabin. Martha Coleman, who'd been watching from her buggy down the road, came rattling into the yard at top speed. Heard the shooting from the crossroads, she said, climbing down with her medical bag. Lord have mercy. What happened here? While Martha tended Johnson's wound, a clean shot through the meat of his upper arm. Painful but not life-threatening. Rachel held Clara close and watched through the window as the remaining men departed. Carlson shot one last venomous look at the cabin before riding off with the Matthews brothers trailing behind. He won't forget this, Martha said quietly, following Rachel's gaze. Men like Randall Carlson don't forgive being made to look foolish. He made himself look foolish, Rachel replied. All we did was stand our ground. Johnson, sitting shirtless while Martha bandaged his arm, spoke for the first time since the shooting. Standing your ground can be dangerous in these parts, especially when you're already on the outside looking in. Rachel moved to stand beside him, still holding Clara, who had finally stopped crying. Then we'll stand together. They can't push us off land we own, can't dissolve a marriage the law recognizes. The law's one thing, Martha said, tying off the bandage. But men like Carlson have ways around the law. You'll need to be watchful. After Martha left with instructions for keeping the wound clean, Rachel put Clara down for a much-needed nap. When she returned to the main room, she found Johnson standing by the broken window, staring out at the yard where Jake Morrison's blood still stained the dust. This is my fault, he said quietly. I brought danger to your door. No. Rachel moved to stand beside him. The danger was always there. You just gave me the strength to face it. He turned to look at her, and she was struck again by the depth of emotion in his dark eyes. When he aimed that rifle at you and Clara. But we're safe. We're all safe. She reached up, hesitant at first, then more sure as she touched his face. You protected us. Again. Rachel. Her name on his lips was part warning, part plea. I know we married for convenience, she said softly, for legal protection. But Johnson, when I saw you bleeding, when I thought... Her voice broke. His good arm came around her, pulling her against him. She could feel his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. I know, he murmured into her hair. I know. They stood there as afternoon shadows lengthened, holding each other in the broken glass and fading light. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. The violence of the day seemed to recede, leaving only this two people who'd found each other against all odds, standing together in the shelter they'd built. What happens now? Rachel asked. Now we heal, we watch, we live our lives as best we can. He pulled back to look at her. But Rachel, if it becomes too dangerous, if Carlson... Stop! She placed her fingers over his lips. We've been through this. I choose to stay. I choose you. I choose us. Something shifted in his expression, a wall coming down that had been there since the beginning. I never expected... He paused, searching for words. When I saw you on that platform, I just wanted to help. I never expected to... To what? To care so much. The admission seemed to cost him. To want things I have no right to want. You have every right, Rachel said fiercely. We both do. We've paid for it in blood and tears and courage. Don't you see they wanted to break us, to make us small and ashamed? But we're still here, still standing. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. They'd need to board up the broken window, tend to the evening chores, face whatever tomorrow would bring. But for now, they stood together in their home, their true home, built not just of logs and stone, but of choices freely made and bonds freely forged. I choose you, too, Johnson said quietly, and Rachel heard in those simple words a promise deeper than any marriage vow. The rain came in earnest then, washing away the blood in the yard, filling the air with the clean scent of wet earth. Clara slept peacefully in her cradle. The old hound dozed by the fire, and life went on, changed by violence, but not broken by it. They were still here, still standing, still choosing each other with every breath, every heartbeat, every moment stolen from a world that said they shouldn't be together. And that, Rachel thought as she leaned into her husband's embrace, was its own kind of victory. The evening had settled into peaceful quiet. The rain had washed the violence from the yard, leaving only the clean scent of wet sage and earth. Rachel sat by the fire, mending one of Johnson's shirts while he whittled a new toy for Clara, a small bear this time, with carefully carved features that were beginning to take shape under his patient hands. Clara lay in her cradle, fed and content, occasionally babbling to herself as babies do when discovering their own voice. The old hound, Moses, stretched out before the hearth with a contented groan. It was a scene of such domestic tranquility that the afternoon's violence seemed like a distant nightmare. "Does it hurt?" Rachel asked, glancing at Johnson's bandaged arm. "I've had worse." He adjusted his grip on the knife, compensating for the injury. "Martha did a fine job. It'll heal clean." They worked in companionable silence, the fire crackling and the rain pattering gently on the roof. Rachel found herself stealing glances at her husband, still strange to think of him that way. Though it felt more natural with each passing hour, the firelight played across his features, softening the hard planes of his face, highlighting the gentleness that others refused to see. "Johnson," she said suddenly, setting down her mending. "Earlier, when you said you chose me too, did you mean it?" He looked up from his carving, meeting her eyes directly. "I don't say things I don't mean, Rachel." "Then tell me." She moved from her chair to sit on the rug near his feet, looking up at him with an openness that made his breath catch. "Tell me when you knew, when you chose." Johnson set aside the wooden bear, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "You want the truth?" "Always." He was quiet for a long moment, gathering words like a man gathering courage. "The moment you took my hand, when I held it out to help you down from that platform, and you took it. Not because you had to, you could have gotten down on your own, but you chose to trust me, even then, a woman who'd been betrayed by everyone who should have protected her, and still you had the courage to reach out." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes. "I was terrified." "But brave." He slid from his chair to join her on the floor, his movements careful of his injured arm. "That's what I saw that day. Not a broken woman, not someone's property. I saw courage wearing a faded blue dress and holding a baby like she was holding the whole world." "You paid so much," Rachel whispered. $200. "I'd have paid 10 times that." The words came fierce and low. "To see you safe, to give Clara a chance, to—" He paused, then continued more softly. "To maybe find something I'd stopped believing existed." "What's that?" "A home. Not just a house, but a home. Someone to build a life with." He reached out with his good hand, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'd been alone so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to come home to someone." Rachel caught his hand, pressed it to her cheek. "I know that feeling. With William, I had a house, but never a home. He wasn't cruel, just absent, even when he was there. He wasn't really there. But you see us, really see us." "I see you," Johnson confirmed. "Every morning when you hum while making breakfast, every time you laugh at Clara's antics, the way you stood up to Carlson and his men, fierce as any warrior, the way you look at me sometimes when you think I don't notice." Heat flooded Rachel's cheeks. "You notice?" "I notice everything about you." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "The way your eyes go green in the sunlight, how you bite your lip when you're concentrating on your sewing, the little sigh you make when you first wake up." "Johnson!" Rachel's heart was racing now, her whole body aware of his nearness. "I know we married for protection," he said. "But Rachel, I need you to know you're not bound to anything more. Just because we spoke words before the Reverend doesn't mean—" She silenced him the only way she could think of, by pressing her lips to his. For a heartbeat. He froze. Then his good arm came around her, pulling her closer as he responded to the kiss with a tenderness that made her ache. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Rachel saw wonder in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked roughly. "Rachel, I can't offer you what a white man could. There will always be people like Carlson. Always be whispers and stares and—" "I don't want what a white man could offer," Rachel interrupted. "I want what you offer. Kindness, strength. A man who carves toys for my daughter and brings me wildflowers. Who stands between us and danger without hesitation. Who sees me as a person, not a possession." "Rachel." Her name was a prayer on his lips. "I choose you," she said firmly. "Not because the law says we're married, not because I need protection. I choose you because when I wake in the morning, you're the first person I want to see. Because when Clara laughs, I want to share it with you. Because somewhere between that auction platform and tonight, you became my home." This time when he kissed her, it was with the passion too long contained, the longing too long denied. Rachel melted against him, feeling safe and wanted and chosen in a way she'd never experienced before. A soft coo from Clara's cradle broke them apart. The baby was awake, watching them with bright, curious eyes. Johnson chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Little one has timing," he murmured. Rachel laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "She's probably hungry again. She's growing so fast." As she rose to tend to Clara, Johnson caught her hand. "Stay with me tonight," he said quietly. "Not because of duty or law, because you want to." Rachel looked at him, this man who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved, who'd given her dignity and hope and love when the world had stripped her of everything. "Yes," she said simply. Later, after Clara had been fed and settled, after the fire had burned low and the rain had stopped, Rachel lay in Johnson's arms in the bed that had been only hers. His injured arm was cushioned carefully, but his other arm held her close, as if she might disappear with the morning light. "What are you thinking?" she asked, tracing patterns on his chest. "That I'm the luckiest man in the territory," he replied. "That somehow, out of all that ugliness and pain, we found this." "The others won't give up easily," Rachel said, voicing the worry that gnawed at her. "Carlson, the Matthews brothers." "Let them come." Johnson's arm tightened around her. "We've faced them before. We'll face them again, but they can't touch what we have here. They can't break what we've chosen to build." Rachel lifted herself on one elbow to look at him. In the moonlight streaming through the window, she could see the strength in his face, the determination that had carried him through a lifetime of being caught between two worlds. "I love you," she said, the words coming as naturally as breathing. "I didn't think I could after everything, but I do." Johnson's eyes glistened in the darkness. "And I love you. Have since you stood up to Deputy Hutchins that first time he came sniffing around. Thought to myself, now there's a woman with steel in her spine." Rachel laughed softly. "Steel that was forged in fire, thanks to you." "No," he said seriously. "It was always there. I just gave you a safe place to show it." They lay together as the night deepened, speaking of dreams and plans, of expanding the garden come spring, of teaching Clara to ride when she was older, of the life they would build day by day, choice by choice. Outside, coyotes sang to the stars and the wind whispered through the pines. But inside the cabin, all was warmth and peace. Clara slept in her cradle, dreaming baby dreams. Moses snored by the dying fire, and in the bed that had become theirs, two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances held each other close. "Thank you," Rachel whispered against Johnson's shoulder. "For what?" "For seeing me, for choosing me, for being brave enough to reach out your hand that day." "Thank you," he replied, "for being brave enough to take it." As sleep claimed them, Rachel thought about the journey that had brought them here, from the despair of the auction platform to the joy of this moment. It had been a road marked by pain and prejudice, violence and fear, but it had also been marked by kindness and courage, by the slow bloom of trust and the sudden fire of love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be those who would never accept their union, who would always see Johnson as less than human and Rachel as fallen. But tonight, in their home built of love and choice, none of that mattered. They had each other. They had Clara. They had a life worth fighting for and the strength to fight for it. And in the end, Rachel thought as she drifted toward dreams, that was everything. They were home. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this journey through the Old West, where love bloomed despite prejudice and two souls found home in each other. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening to this story. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let us know your thoughts on Rachel and Johnson's tale. Your support means everything to us. And we can't wait to share more stories of courage, love, and the untamed frontier with you.